I got into my husband's car that morning, because I needed to grab my umbrella before the rain started. When I opened the glove compartment, I froze. There it was, a small, half-used tube of personal lubricant. I didn't say a word. I didn't scream, cry, or demand an explanation. I just quietly took it out, replaced it with a tube of melted wax I had from my candle-making kit, and put it right back where I found it. At that moment, I didn't know that what I had just done would cause a scene so wild that our neighbors would call the firefighters, who would later have to physically pull my husband and his mistress apart. If you're listening to my story, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I really want to know how far this story of revenge has traveled. I sat at the kitchen table that night, the silence in our home thick and heavy, pressing down on me like fog. The clock on the wall, our wedding gift from my late mother, ticked steadily, each second echoing louder than the last. Tick. 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 Each sound felt like a reminder of something I could no longer ignore, that my marriage, my comfort, my supposed happiness, might all be a lie. My husband, Julian, had just returned from yet another one of his endless business dinners. He didn't just look tired, he looked haunted, like a man carrying a secret too heavy to bear. He tossed his jacket onto the couch, loosened his tie dramatically, and collapsed onto the bed without so much as a good night. The faint scent of his cologne filled the room, only this time, it was mixed with a sweet, unfamiliar perfume. Not mine. I stood there in the hallway, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. When his soft snoring began, I exhaled shakily. The sound that used to comfort me now felt like a cruel mockery. Moving with the slow, practiced calm of a wife of 40 years, I began tidying up the mess he'd left behind, his wallet, his jacket, his phone, all scattered like pieces of his second life. That's when I saw it. His phone screen was still lit. A new email notification blinked faintly in the dark. I frowned. Julian never used email. All that tech stuff's too complicated, he always said. If I need you, I'll just call. But curiosity and dread guided my hand. I picked up the phone and saw the first few words of the message right there on the lock screen. You were amazing tonight, Dad Redheart. My blood ran cold. Dad. Who would write that to him, and with a heart emoji? I unlocked the phone. The message was brief, but it hit like a bullet. I stared at it until the words blurred. The address was strange, random letters and numbers, no photo, no name, no clue. My hands trembled so much I almost dropped the phone. Julian turned over in bed, snoring softly, peaceful as ever. I placed the phone back carefully, exactly where I'd found it, then stood frozen in the living room. The house felt different now, colder, emptier, foreign. A woman's intuition, it's not loud, but when it speaks, you listen. I started gathering his clothes to take to the laundry when I found something else in his trouser pocket, a neatly folded receipt from a steakhouse in another city. The date, that same night. The order, dinner for two. The drink, a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon. The same one we'd shared years ago for our anniversary. He had told me he was dining with business partners in Dallas. But the receipt said San Antonio. A quiet laugh slipped out of me, sharp and bitter. Julian hated driving to Dallas. San Antonio, though? That city held his fondest memories. His mother's old home, his favorite restaurants, the places he always said he'd take me to someday again. Someday never came. I took out my phone, snapped a photo of the receipt, then another of the email. Proof, not panic. Because if there's one thing a woman learns after 40 years of marriage, it's that silence speaks louder than words. And that night, my silence was roaring. The next morning, I woke before the sun. Sleep had abandoned me long before the alarm could. I just sat there at the edge of the bed, listening to the soft rhythm of Julian's breathing beside me, that steady, careless snore that used to make me smile. Now it made my stomach turn. I went to the kitchen and started breakfast the same way I had every morning for 40 years. 2 eggs. Toast. Strong black coffee, the way he liked it. My hands moved on their own, whisking, toasting, frying, but my mind was a storm. I kept seeing that email, that perfume bottle of words, "You were amazing tonight, Dad Red Heart." It had burned itself into the back of my eyelids. When Julian finally came downstairs, he looked exactly as he always did, freshly shaved, a clean shirt, pretending life was normal. He smiled that same tired smile, kissed the air near my cheek, and sat down at the table. "Morning, sweetheart," he said casually, as if his entire double life weren't unraveling in front of me. I watched him sip his coffee, calm and unbothered, while my own cup shook in my hand. "You're quiet today," he said, not even looking up from his phone. "I didn't sleep well," I replied softly, forcing a faint smile. "Too much on my mind." He just nodded, distracted. Then, as if on cue, he added the same line he'd used 100 times before. "I've got an important meeting today. I might be home late." I smiled, that same polite, obedient smile he'd come to expect. But inside, a fire was spreading, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. He finished half his coffee, patted me on the shoulder like a colleague, not a wife, and left. The front door shut. The sound echoed through the empty house like a final warning. I stood there for a moment, still holding the dish towel in my hands. Then I whispered to no one, "All right, Julian. Let's see where this meeting really is." I went straight to my phone and scrolled through my old contacts until I found a number I hadn't dialed in years, Mrs. Miller. She was an old friend from the early days of my bakery. Back when life still felt honest. She once told me, "If you ever need to find out the truth about someone, Juliet, I know a man who can help." I never thought I'd need that advice. But that morning, I did. When she picked up, her warm voice felt like sunlight through rain. "Juliet. It's been so long. How are you?" "I need your help, Mrs. Miller," I said, my voice trembling. "Could you give me the number of that investigator you once mentioned?" There was a long pause. I could almost hear her understanding the pain behind my words. "Oh, Juliet," she sighed. "You deserve better than whatever you've discovered. His name is Thomas. He's discreet. I'll text you his number." Minutes later, her message came through. "Thomas Green, private investigator. I can help you. Just tell me where to begin." I sat there staring at the text, my heart pounding. Then I replied, "Meet me at noon, at Café Del Marche. I'll bring what I have." By noon, the city was buzzing, but inside that small cafe, time stood still. I sat in the farthest corner, wearing dark glasses, hands wrapped around my coffee cup like it was a lifeline. Thomas arrived right on time, a calm, middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a quiet confidence. He introduced himself softly, took a seat, and waited. I slid a flash drive across the table. Inside were the photos I'd taken, the steakhouse receipt, the strange email, and the tube of lubricant. "My husband is cheating on me," I said simply. The words came out flat, like I'd already practiced saying them in my head 100 times. Thomas looked at the photos, his face unreadable. Then he nodded. "I'll follow him," he said. Discreetly. "If he's hiding something, I'll find it." He slid his notebook into his jacket and stood. "Go home, Mrs. Roberts," he said gently. "Pretend nothing is wrong. I'll be in touch." When he left, I sat there alone in the cafe, watching strangers pass by through the window. Couples laughing. Friends talking. People living their small, ordinary lives. I had no idea that mine, the life I'd built for 40 years, had already started to crumble. And as I stirred my cold coffee, one thought came to me, quiet but sharp as glass. The next time Julian walked through that front door, I wouldn't just be his wife. I'd be his judge. The next evening, the bakery smelled of cinnamon and butter. I was kneading dough, trying to lose myself in the rhythm of work, when my phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. My heart skipped. I wiped my hands and picked it up. "Thomas, Mrs. Roberts, I found something. Check your messages in 1 minute." That 1 minute felt longer than my entire marriage. When the photos came through, I didn't breathe. The first image showed Julian outside a fancy restaurant in Riverside, the same city printed on that steakhouse receipt. His hand was wrapped around a woman's waist. The picture was clear enough that I could see her red lipstick, the kind of bold, careless red I'd stopped wearing years ago. Then I zoomed in. My body went cold. It was Allison. My daughter-in-law. My son's wife. The phone nearly slipped from my hands. No. No, this had to be wrong. Maybe it just looked like her, a coincidence, a cruel trick of light. But the next photo left no doubt. There she was again, walking beside Julian, laughing, holding his hand like she belonged there. The timestamp said 9:14 p.m. That same night, Julian had told me he was stuck in a late meeting. I felt my legs weaken. I sank into a chair, staring at the phone until the cafe music in the background of the photo seemed to echo in my ears. Thomas, they had dinner at La Rosa Bistro. 2 entrees, 1 dessert, 1 bottle of Cabernet. After dinner, they left together. Same car. Same direction. I didn't reply right away. I couldn't. My throat had gone dry. How could he? How could they? I had welcomed that girl into my home, taught her how to bake, held her hand when she cried over small arguments with my son. And Julian, the man who used to whisper that I was his only home in the world. Now they were sharing wine and secrets under candlelight. I pressed a trembling hand against my mouth to stop the sound that wanted to escape, half cry, half scream. At 11 p.m., another message arrived. Thomas, they checked into the Magnolia Suites Hotel. Room 307. I'll keep surveillance. I stared at the number. Room 307. It repeated in my head like a curse. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. I walked to the window of my bakery and looked out at the empty street. The glow of the streetlights blurred in the glass, doubling everything, 2 Juliets, 2 worlds, 1 ending. I whispered to myself, 40 years. I gave him 40 years. The photos sat open on my screen, each one slicing me a little deeper. Julian's face, lit by restaurant lights, was relaxed, happy, almost young again. The same look he used to give me when we were new and poor and full of hope. Now, he looked at her that way. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed at the bakery until dawn, sorting receipts I couldn't see, pretending to work because if I stopped, I'd have to feel. When the morning light hit the windows, I opened my phone again and saved every photo, every message, every timestamp onto a flash drive. Evidence. Not emotion. By the time I got home, Julian was in the kitchen, humming softly as he flipped through a newspaper. He looked up and smiled. You're up early. Couldn't sleep? I forced a calm nod. Just had a lot on my mind. He folded the paper and kissed my cheek. Don't stress so much. You work too hard. I stared at him, at the lips that had touched hers just hours before, and my stomach twisted. That moment, something inside me died quietly, without drama, without sound. But something else was born in its place, colder, steadier. The woman who had loved him for 40 years was gone. The woman who would destroy his lies had just woken up. The sun hadn't even set when my phone vibrated again. I was standing behind the counter at the bakery, boxing pastries for a hotel order when I saw Thomas's name flash across the screen. My pulse quickened. Thomas, Mrs. Roberts, I have confirmation. Sending everything now. I excused myself, walked into the back room, and locked the door. The smell of sugar and vanilla still hung in the air, but it suddenly made me nauseous. The first photo came in. Julian again, but this time in daylight. He was walking beside Allison outside a law office downtown. Her hair was tied up neatly, sunglasses covering half her face, and her smile, her shameless smile, looked like victory. The next picture nearly made me drop the phone. They were at a 4-star hotel, the Magnolia Suites again, only this time, Thomas's telephoto lens caught them on the balcony of room 307. Julian's arm was wrapped tightly around her waist. She leaned into him, laughing, the kind of laughter you share with someone you know intimately. And then, he kissed her. Not a quick, stolen kiss. A deep, deliberate one. I felt my chest cave in. My knees weakened until I had to sit on a crate of flour just to stay upright. The photos kept coming. Them checking in. Them holding hands in the lobby. Her resting her head on his shoulder. Thomas, they'd been renting the same room for the past 3 weeks. Every Thursday afternoon. I also overheard their conversation. They're discussing documents, contracts, ownership transfers. Documents? Ownership transfers? My mind struggled to piece it together. Then came the audio file. I plugged in my headphones with trembling hands and pressed play. Then came the audio file. I plugged in my headphones with trembling hands and pressed play. Allison's voice filled my ears, soft and cruel. Dad, hurry up and finish that paperwork. I want the bakery chain transferred before she even knows what happened. Dad. The same word from the email. Then Julian's voice, calm, confident, venomous. Relax. Juliet trusts me too much. I'll handle the signatures. She won't suspect a thing. My mouth went dry. I gripped the counter to keep from collapsing. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was theft. They were planning to take everything, the bakery I'd built from scratch, the business that carried my name, my mother's recipes, my life's work. And all the while, Julian had been sleeping in our bed, smiling across the breakfast table, patting my shoulder as if nothing had changed. I hit stop on the recording, took a deep breath, and started again. I needed every word burned into my brain. Every whisper, every laugh. When the file ended, I copied it onto my flash drive, labeled it truth, and tucked it beneath the till where I kept the day's earnings. That evening, Julian came home humming to himself, smelling faintly of perfume and whiskey. He tossed his keys on the counter and said casually, "Tough day. Had to sign a bunch of new contracts." Contracts? I asked, my tone light, almost playful. He froze for a fraction of a second, just enough for me to see the life flicker in his eyes. Then he smiled. Yes. Nothing important. You know how it is. I smiled back. Oh, I do. He didn't notice my shaking hands as I poured him a glass of water. He didn't notice that I stared at his face a little too long, memorizing every line of the man I used to love. When he left the kitchen, I whispered to myself. You wanted to play with fire, Julian. You're about to learn what it feels like to burn. That night, I opened my laptop, replayed the photos, and printed them one by one. Julian and Allison, walking, kissing, touching. Each sheet that came out of the printer felt like a bullet I was loading into a gun. I slid them into an envelope and labeled it simply, "For when he lies." Then, before turning out the lights, I took one last look at the photo of my family on the wall, Julian, our son Daniel, Allison, and me. Our smiles were perfect. Our clothes immaculate. Our eyes full of lies I hadn't yet seen. I traced the image with my finger and whispered. Enjoy your last peaceful night, Julian. Because tomorrow, I start collecting my justice. The next morning, the sky was pale and heavy, the kind of color that makes everything look washed out. I stood by the kitchen counter, holding a mug of black coffee that had long gone cold. Julian was upstairs humming, his footsteps light, too light, as if guilt didn't exist in his world. He came down in a clean shirt, smelling like aftershave and mint. Big day, he said casually, tucking his tie. Got another meeting out of town. Might not be home until late. The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that if I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed it. Out of town again? I asked softly. He nodded, avoiding my eyes. San Antonio. The name hit me like a slap. San Antonio, the same city from the receipt, from the photos, from the balcony where he'd kissed my daughter-in-law. I bit down hard on my tongue and managed a calm smile. Drive safely, Julian. And don't forget your briefcase. He kissed my cheek like a polite stranger and walked out the door. When the sound of his car faded, I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The wall seemed to close in. The air smelled like his cologne, and her perfume, faint but undeniable. I couldn't stand it. I opened the windows wide and let the cold morning breeze rush in. Then I reached for my phone. Me, Thomas, he's gone. Follow him. Thomas, already on it. I'll update you soon. Hours crawled by. I tried to distract myself with work at the bakery, but every tick of the clock felt like a countdown. When my phone finally buzzed around 3 p.m., I jumped. Thomas, he's with the same woman again. Same hotel. Room 307. Me, get everything. Photos. Video. Sound if possible. Minutes later, the files started coming in, one by one, each a knife twisting deeper. The first was a short clip. Julian, opening the car door for Allison like a gentleman, guiding her out with that old, careful tenderness I hadn't seen in years. She was wearing a beige dress, her hair in a ponytail, sunglasses covering her eyes, as if shame could be hidden behind lenses. Then came another photo, her hand brushing against his chest, his palm resting on her back. A pair of lovers moving through a world they believed they owned. I stared at the screen until my tears blurred it. My son's wife. My husband. The betrayal didn't just hurt, it humiliated. Every family dinner, every smile, every shared holiday replayed in my mind like a cruel joke. By the time Thomas sent the last file, my body was shaking. It was an audio clip, recorded from outside their room. I put on my earphones and pressed play. Allison's voice was soft and teasing. Dad, hurry up. Once the papers are done, we'll have everything. She's too old to notice. Julian's laugh followed. She's so naive. I've been preparing the fake contracts for weeks. By next month, the bakery will be ours. The sound of their laughter made my stomach twist. I ripped the earphones out and slammed my hands against the table, shaking with rage. How dare they? The bakery was mine, my life's work, the one thing I had built from nothing. 40 years of sweat, nights without sleep, endless deliveries, all so they could steal it from me? I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. When I opened them again, the tears were gone. What replaced them was colder, a stillness sharp enough to cut glass. That's when I realized. The time for crying was over. The time for planning had begun. That evening, Julian came home pretending to be exhausted. He dropped his briefcase on the floor and stretched his arms. Traffic was awful, he sighed. I'm dead tired. I didn't even look up from the book in my hands. Oh? How was San Antonio? He froze for half a second, then smiled. Fine. Productive. We'll probably close the deal next week. I nodded slowly. Wonderful. I'm sure you've worked so hard. He didn't catch the sharpness in my tone. He poured himself a glass of wine and started talking about meaningless things, weather, sports, neighborhood gossip. Every word sounded like static. When he finally went to bed, I stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door. My heart was pounding, but not with fear anymore. I whispered to myself. You've taken my trust, my peace, my family. But I will take something from you, too. And you'll never see it coming. Then I turned off the lights, went to my desk, and opened the drawer where I kept my candle-making kit. Inside, a small block of hardened wax glimmered faintly under the lamplight. And for the first time in weeks, I smiled. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat in the quiet glow of the kitchen, the house still except for the slow ticking of that old clock, the one that used to comfort me. Now it only counted down to the end of everything I thought I knew. Julian's snores drifted through the half-open door like a taunt. He could rest so easily while I sat there shaking. On the table in front of me lay the photos, the recordings, and the receipts. Each one a small piece of proof. Each one a reason. But revenge needed precision, not rage. I opened the drawer beside the sink and pulled out a small box, my candle-making kit. Inside were sticks of wax, dyes, wicks, and a little melting pot. I had used them years ago to make scented candles for the bakery's tables. Funny how something meant to bring warmth would now help me set fire to the last lie in my house. I filled the pot with pieces of clear wax and set it on the stove. The faint crackle of melting filled the kitchen, blending with the hum of the refrigerator. I stirred slowly, my hand steady for the first time in days. When the wax turned smooth and liquid, I poured it carefully into a small measuring cup and left it to cool just enough to thicken. Then I reached for the object that had started it all, that cheap, shameful tube from Julian's glove compartment. The cap was sticky, my fingers trembled as I unscrewed it. I emptied the contents into the sink, washed the inside with hot water, and held it under the light. The plastic gleamed, empty now, ready for a new purpose. I took a deep breath and poured the melted wax into the tube, drop by drop, until it was full. The smell of heated wax mixed with the faint trace of cologne still lingering in the air. When I screwed the cap back on, the texture looked exactly the same. Soft. Innocent. Deadly. I smiled, a quiet, exhausted smile. The next morning, Julian was still asleep when I crept into the garage. His car sat there, silent and smug. I opened the glove compartment and placed the new tube right where the old one had been, nozzle facing forward. I adjusted everything, the papers, the spare keys, the map, until the scene looked untouched. Then I stood there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel, the seat where he had sat beside her. For a brief second, my reflection appeared in the windshield, tired eyes, gray hair, hands that had baked thousands of loaves and cleaned this man's messes for decades. "You thought I'd never notice," I whispered. "But you forgot who taught you patience." I closed the door softly and went back inside. Over breakfast, Julian behaved as if nothing existed beyond his own routine. He read the news on his phone, sipped his coffee, and complained about his boss. "I might have to drive out of town again tonight," he said, not even looking up. I nodded. "That's fine. I'm taking a short trip myself. Maybe to Nashville. A new supplier wants to meet." He looked surprised, then almost pleased. "Really? That's great. You deserve a little change of air." His relief was so obvious I nearly laughed. "I'll be leaving early," I said. "You don't have to wait up." "Of course," he replied, kissing the top of my head. "Safe travels." Safe travels. The words tasted like poison. The moment he left for work, I packed a small bag and walked across the street to my neighbor Mrs. Peterson's house. She was watering her plants when she saw me approach. "Juliet. You look pale, dear. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said with a shaky smile. "Actually, I need to ask you a favor. Could I stay here for a few hours tomorrow morning? Just to keep an eye on something." Her brows knit in confusion, but she nodded kindly. "Of course, dear. You don't even have to ask." I thanked her, squeezed her hand, and went back home. That evening, I prepared the final step, the little smoke trap. In the kitchen, I filled a small skillet with oil and tied a thin string to the stove igniter. The other end I looped through the window frame and attached to an old coffee tin. With a single pull, the flame would light the oil and create thick, black smoke, just enough to alarm the neighbors. I tested it once. The smoke rose fast, curling upward like a warning ghost. I opened the window wider and waved the air clear. Everything was ready. By the time I finished, Julian was home again, humming, tired, and clueless. He kissed my cheek, ate his dinner, and mumbled something about being so grateful for my understanding. I smiled through it all. That night, while he slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, eyes open, watching the shadows move across the ceiling. The house felt like a stage, and every heartbeat was a drum before the curtain rose. Tomorrow, the show would begin. And when it did, the whole neighborhood would see the truth. I woke before dawn. The house was wrapped in silence, except for the faint rhythm of Julian's snoring in the bedroom. The air was heavy with the scent of his cologne from last night, and it made my stomach tighten. The plan was already in motion, all that was left was to play my part. I slipped quietly out of bed, careful not to wake him, and went straight to the dresser. Inside the bottom drawer, hidden beneath old family photos, was Daniel's college recorder, a small black device I'd given him years ago to capture lectures. I checked the batteries, pressed record, and watched the red light blink steadily. Then I looked at the bedroom wall, the headboard, the photo of our family smiling at Daniel's wedding. I remembered Allison in her white dress, radiant, hugging Julian like a daughter should. Now that same woman would be sneaking into my house to destroy it. I placed the recorder behind the bookshelf, near the headboard, where the sound would be clearest. I covered it with that family photo. Irony has a dark sense of humor. "Let's see how sweet your laughter sounds when the truth plays back," I whispered. By the time Julian stirred, I was already dressed and pacing the kitchen, my packed handbag beside me. The clock read 6:15 a.m. He rubbed his eyes as he stumbled in, pretending to be surprised. "You're up early." "I told you," I said, keeping my voice calm, "I have that trip to Nashville today. The new supplier wants to sign the contract in person." He blinked, then smiled that rehearsed smile I'd grown to hate. Right. "That's great, sweetheart. Drive safe." He didn't even offer to help me with my bag. He just poured his coffee, yawned, and looked almost relieved. When he turned away, I whispered quietly, "You'll get your wish, Julian." At exactly 7 a.m., I walked out the front door with my suitcase, waved at Mrs. Peterson across the street, and headed to her house instead of the station. "Goodness, Juliet," she said, opening the door in her robe. "You look nervous. Is everything all right?" "I just need to sit by your window for a while," I said softly. "I'm keeping an eye on something." She hesitated but nodded. "Of course, dear. Come in." From her living room window, I had a perfect view of my front door. The morning was still gray, the neighborhood quiet, the kind of calm that almost hums before a storm. At 10 o'clock sharp, a taxi stopped in front of my house. The door opened, and out stepped Allison, her hair loose, her lips bright red, wearing a floral dress far too bold for a morning visit. She looked around nervously, then walked quickly to the door. A moment later, Julian appeared. He was grinning like a fool, waving her inside. I gripped my coffee cup tightly, my knuckles white. Mrs. Peterson sat beside me in silence, sensing something was very wrong. "Juliet," she started gently. I just shook my head. "Not yet." I pulled out my phone and opened the app that linked to the hidden recorder. My headphones trembled in my hands as I pressed play. At first, there was laughter, light, careless laughter that filled the house like poison. Then Allison's voice, breathless. "Finally. We don't have to sneak around anymore. The old hag's gone." Julian's deep voice followed, smug and confident. "Relax. She won't be back until late tonight. We have all day." The bed creaked, the sound of whispering and movement. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to keep listening. Every sound stabbed like glass, but I needed proof. I needed the whole picture before the fire started, literally and otherwise. Then came Allison's sudden cry, sharp and panicked. "Julian! What the hell, we're stuck." Julian's voice turned frantic. "What are you talking about? Move, just, wait, what?" Her voice rose into a scream. "It's not coming off." "What did you use?" I almost smiled. The wax had set perfectly. I pulled the string on my improvised smoke trap from Mrs. Peterson's window. Within seconds, thick, dark smoke began curling out of my kitchen window across the street. Mrs. Peterson gasped. "Juliet, your house, it's on fire." I grabbed her arm gently, my voice calm. "It's just smoke," I said. "But the fire department doesn't know that." Within minutes, the neighborhood came alive. Doors opened, people shouted. Someone yelled, "Call the firefighters," and the shrill wail of sirens began to rise in the distance. Through the haze of smoke, I could already see shadows moving behind my curtains, Julian's panicked silhouette and Allison's flailing arms. I slipped the headphones off and whispered, almost lovingly, "Showtime." The sound of sirens grew louder, echoing down our quiet suburban street like a trumpet announcing Judgment Day. I stood at Mrs. Peterson's window, motionless, watching smoke pour from my kitchen window in thick, curling waves. Neighbors rushed out in confusion, bathrobes, slippers, phones in hand. "Juliet's house is on fire," someone shouted. "Call 911, another yelled, though the sound of sirens meant help was already on the way. Mrs. Peterson turned to me, pale and trembling. "Juliet, your house, your home. We have to do something." I sipped my coffee calmly. "They'll handle it," I said softly. "They always do." She blinked at me, confused by my calm. I didn't explain. I just kept my eyes on the smoke, waiting for the final act to begin. The red truck screeched to a stop in front of my house. Firefighters jumped out in heavy gear, barking orders. But the man who stepped out of the driver's seat made my breath hitch for the first time all morning. Daniel. My son. My boy. He was in uniform, his face tense, focused, brave. I hadn't realized until that moment that fate could be so cruel, that he would be the one sent to save his father and his wife. "Clear the area," he shouted to the neighbors, his deep voice commanding. "There might be people inside." I covered my mouth with my hand. Mrs. Peterson looked at me in disbelief. "Your son, Juliet, that's your son." "He's—" "Yes," I whispered, my throat tightening. "That's my son." From where we stood, we could see the front door burst open under Daniel's sledgehammer. Black smoke poured out, followed by the sound of coughing, panic, and muffled screams. Then, through the haze, came the voice I knew too well, frantic, desperate. "Help! We can't move." Daniel froze in the doorway. "Dad," he shouted. There was a pause. Then a woman's voice cried out, broken, high-pitched, humiliated. "Daniel! Please! Help us!" The entire neighborhood went silent. Everyone turned. Mrs. Peterson gasped, her hand clutching my arm. "Oh, dear Lord," she whispered. "That's Allison." I watched Daniel push through the smoke, his men close behind. The crackle of extinguishers filled the air as the flames died down to steam. Moments later, I heard his voice again, but this time, it wasn't steady. What is this?" A firefighter beside him muttered in disbelief. "Chief, they're stuck together." There was silence, then another voice, nervous, almost pitying. "Oh my God. That's his wife and his father." The crowd erupted in horrified whispers. "Father-in-law and daughter-in-law? In her own house? What kind of monsters?" I felt my heart ache for Daniel, but I didn't look away. I had to see this through. Julian's choices had dragged all of us into the fire. It was only right that he burn in the truth he created. Through the window, I could see the commotion, sheets being thrown, medics rushing in, firefighters exchanging uneasy glances. The neighbors began recording with their phones, their voices trembling between shock and laughter. "Oh, it's them. That's Juliet's husband. And her son's wife? Oh, Lord, how shameful." Mrs. Peterson's voice cracked beside me. "Juliet, tell me you didn't know about this." I turned to her, my eyes wet but calm. "I knew," I said quietly. "Every detail. Every lie. Every meeting." She stared at me, horror and understanding blending in her face. You planned this." I didn't answer. Instead, I looked back out at the scene unfolding, Julian and Allison, pale and half-covered, being carried out on separate stretchers, their faces twisted in pain and humiliation. Daniel followed behind them, motionless, his helmet dangling from one hand, his other hand clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. The sirens quieted as the ambulance doors slammed shut. The crowd began to murmur louder, judgment spilling like wildfire. What a disgrace. Poor Juliet. Imagine your own husband and your son's wife. Someone near the truck started laughing in disbelief. They'll never live this down. I watched the ambulance pull away, its lights flashing against the smoke-stained walls of my house. The bakery apron I'd been wearing earlier still clung to my waist, faintly dusted with flour, a reminder that life would go on, even after this. Mrs. Peterson wiped her eyes and whispered, "Juliet, what have you done?" I didn't reply. I just whispered to myself, almost like a prayer. Justice. Finally, justice. Then I turned from the window, took one last sip of my coffee, and walked toward the door. The show was over. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and regret. That sharp, cold scent that clings to every hallway and lingers in your clothes. I walked through those bright corridors with my head high, pretending to be the concerned wife everyone expected me to be. But underneath that calm exterior, every step was measured, deliberate, and burning with purpose. At the reception desk, the young nurse recognized my last name before I even spoke. Her polite smile faltered just slightly, just enough to tell me that the entire staff already knew. "Mrs. Roberts," she said softly. "Your husband and the other patient are both stable. They're in room 312. Her voice wavered on other patient. I could almost taste her discomfort. "Thank you," I replied sweetly. "I'd like to see them." She hesitated. "They're, resting. It's been a difficult morning." I smiled, the kind of smile that cuts more than it comforts. "Yes, I imagine it has." When I reached room 312, I paused at the doorway. Inside, Julian sat propped up in bed, his skin pale, a bandage on his wrist. Beside him, Allison lay on the second bed, her face turned toward the wall, her hair tangled, her eyes swollen from crying. They looked small. Defeated. Pathetic. The nurse was adjusting Julian's fore. When she noticed me, she stepped back politely. "I'll give you a moment," she murmured before slipping out. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Only the rhythmic beep of the monitors filled the space. Julian looked up at me. His lips trembled before he spoke. "Juliet. I can explain." The same words every guilty man thinks will fix everything. I walked slowly to the small table between their beds and placed 2 tubes down, identical, neatly labeled ointments the nurse had given me at the counter. Except these weren't the ones she'd handed over. I'd already switched them in the hallway with the 2 tubes of spicy Dijon mustard I'd hidden in my purse earlier. I leaned closer, my voice soft, almost tender. "You don't have to explain, Julian. You've already said enough." He tried to sit up, groaning. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I swear." "Oh, I believe that," I interrupted. "You were never supposed to get caught." Allison turned her head toward me, her lips quivering. "Please, Mrs. Roberts. I'm sorry." I studied her face for a long, quiet moment. She looked young, too young for this level of ruin, but she had chosen her path. "Do you know what's funny, Allison?" I said softly. "When you joined our family, I thought you were a blessing. I taught you how to bake, how to build something with your hands. And now you've learned how to destroy." Her eyes filled with tears. "Please, I didn't mean to." "Yes, you did," I said sharply. "You both did. You meant every lie, every whisper, every night at that hotel." Julian lowered his head, the weight of shame finally settling on him. "Juliet, please." I looked at him for the last time not as my husband, but as a stranger wearing his face. "You planned to steal my business," I said. "You planned to ruin me. But you forgot something, Julian, I built that bakery from nothing. I survived harder days than this. You only ever survived because I carried you." I turned to leave, my voice steady. "The doctor said to apply that ointment every few hours. It should help with the burns." I was halfway down the hallway when the first scream came. It was Allison, high-pitched, piercing. It burns. My skin's on fire. Julian's voice followed, loud and panicked. What the hell is this? Somebody help. Nurses rushed past me, shouting, pushing a cart of supplies. I stepped aside, clutching my purse, my face the perfect mask of concern. When the door to room 312 burst open, a nurse shouted, they used the wrong tubes. This isn't ointment, it's mustard. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the corridor. I turned toward the window and looked out at the parking lot, letting their screams fade into a dull, distant hum. Outside, the sun had finally broken through the morning clouds. Its light spilled across the asphalt, warm and golden, the same light that had once filled my bakery in the early days. I smiled faintly. When I walked out of the hospital a few minutes later, the press was already gathering at the entrance. Someone had leaked the scandal, maybe a nurse, maybe a curious bystander from the neighborhood. The whole city was talking. I heard a reporter mutter to another, that's her, Mrs. Roberts, the wife. She's the one who caught them. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I simply walked past them, my heels clicking against the concrete, my shoulders straight, the faint scent of wax still lingering on my hands. The story was no longer mine alone. It belonged to everyone now, to the whispers, the headlines, and the endless gossip that would haunt Julian and Allison for the rest of their lives. Justice had found its audience. By the time I returned to the hospital the next morning, the scandal had already made its rounds across town. The bakery doorbell hadn't stopped ringing since dawn, not with customers, but with curious faces pretending to buy pastries just to whisper, "Did you hear about Juliet's husband?" People love a story that proves evil gets what it deserves. I wore my neatest dress that day, a deep gray one I'd saved for funerals. It felt appropriate. When I entered room 312 again, Julian looked up instantly. His eyes were bloodshot, his face drawn, his hand bandaged from what the nurses called minor chemical irritation. Allison sat on the other bed, pale and silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. No one spoke. The silence was its own punishment. Finally, Julian cleared his throat. "Juliet, please, sit down. I need to explain." "Don't waste your breath," I said quietly. I pulled a thick envelope from my bag and dropped it on the table between us. The sound echoed like a gavel. "What's this?" he asked, his voice small. "Your freedom," I said. "And mine." Inside the envelope were 2 sets of papers, divorce documents I'd drafted years ago after one of our smaller betrayals, when he'd gambled away part of our savings but begged forgiveness. I'd kept them locked away, unfinished, waiting for the day I might need them. That day had finally arrived. I slid a pen toward him. "Sign." He looked at the papers as if they were poison. "Juliet, 40 years. You can't just erase that." I tilted my head slightly. "You already did. You just used someone else's hands to do it." Allison looked up then, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please, Mrs. Roberts. I'll leave Daniel. I'll disappear. Just don't ruin his career over this." Her voice trembled like a child's. For a moment, I almost pitied her, almost. "You've already ruined enough," I said. "You don't need my help for that." She buried her face in her hands. Julian reached across the table as if to grab my wrist. "Juliet, I made a mistake." I stepped back, cold and steady. "No, Julian. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or saying something cruel in anger. What you did was a decision. You decided to betray me. You decided to sleep with your son's wife. You decided to steal my business." His face crumpled. "I don't even know who I am anymore." I nodded slowly. "That makes 2 of us." The door opened, and Daniel stepped in. My son looked older than he had 2 days ago, older by years. His uniform was gone, replaced by jeans and a simple t-shirt. His eyes, once bright, were hollow now. He didn't look at his wife. Not once. Mom, he said softly, his voice rough, did you bring them? I handed him the second envelope. Inside were copies of the evidence, the photos, the recordings, the receipts, everything Thomas had collected. Daniel placed it beside Julian's bed. These go to the lawyer this afternoon, he said flatly. I'm filing the report for fraud, Dad. You tried to transfer Mom's business behind her back. Julian's eyes widened. Daniel, no. Don't, Daniel snapped. Don't call me that. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in Julian's face. Allison just wept silently into her blanket. When the nurse came in with the clipboard, I handed her the divorce documents. Please make sure he signs before discharge, I said politely. She nodded, glancing between us with quiet understanding. Julian looked at me, his mouth trembling. Is this really what you want, Juliet? I met his eyes, steady and unflinching. No, Julian. It's what you've earned. Then I turned to Daniel and said softly, let's go home, son. As we walked out of the room, Allison sobbed quietly behind us. Julian didn't speak again. The door clicked shut, cutting off their voices, the sound of a chapter ending. Outside, the afternoon light was soft and golden. Cars passed, people talked, life continued. Daniel stopped beside the hospital gate. Mom, he whispered, his voice breaking, I don't know how to live with this. I took his hand, squeezing it gently. You don't live with it, I said. You live beyond it. He nodded slowly, tears glistening in his eyes. For the first time in months, I felt the weight on my chest lift, not because I'd won, but because I'd finally let go. Julian and Allison would spend their lives trapped in the ashes of their own choices. I would build something new from the remains. And as Daniel and I walked away from that hospital, I whispered to myself the words that had guided me through every betrayal, every heartbreak, every lonely night. You can't control who hurts you. But you can decide who walks away whole. The days that followed felt both too long and too fast, like time itself couldn't decide whether to punish me or let me heal. The story of Julian and Allison had spread across the city like wildfire. By the end of the week, everyone knew. Their names were whispered in cafes, printed in gossip columns, and muttered behind pitying smiles at church. People pointed when I passed by, but not with shame, with awe. Some said I was ruthless. Others said I was brave. But I didn't feel like either. I just felt free. Daniel moved back home a few days after the divorce papers were signed. He didn't talk much at first. He'd wake up early, sit at the kitchen table in silence, his coffee untouched, staring at nothing. Then one morning, as the bakery's ovens hummed to life, he said quietly, Mom, can I help? I looked up from the dough I was kneading. With what? With the bakery. The orders. Whatever you need. It was the first time he'd spoken more than a few words since the hospital. I smiled, soft but sincere. You really mean that? He nodded. I need something to focus on. And this is ours. The next day, he showed up at sunrise, sleeves rolled up, ready to work. Watching him measure flour and carry trays reminded me of Julian in the early years, before greed and lies had hollowed him out. But where Julian had once filled the bakery with noise, Daniel filled it with peace. We didn't talk about the scandal. We didn't have to. It hung in the air like the scent of fresh bread, faint, persistent, impossible to forget but slowly fading. By the second week, customers had tripled. People who had never set foot in my bakery before suddenly wanted to support me. Juliet, you're an inspiration, one woman said, clutching her box of pastries. You showed every woman that silence can be strength. I smiled politely. I didn't tell her that strength hadn't felt like silence at all, it had felt like screaming into a pillow until the rage burned itself out. Still, business was booming. The oven stayed warm from dawn till dusk, and Daniel managed the new branch orders with calm precision. At night, we'd close up, sit at the little table by the window, and eat flan together, the same dessert I'd taught Allison to make years ago. I tried not to think about that. One night, Daniel looked up from his plate. "Mom," he said quietly, "do you ever regret what you did?" I thought about that for a long moment before answering. "No," I said. "I regret what led to it. But not what I did." He nodded slowly, understanding more than I said. A month later, a lawyer called to confirm that the divorce was finalized. The house, the bakery, the savings, everything remained in my name. Julian had signed away his share without a fight. Maybe guilt had finally done what my forgiveness never could. He and Allison had moved out of the city. Word was, they were living quietly, far from the neighbors who'd once envied them. I didn't ask where. I didn't need to know. What mattered was the peace that had returned to my home. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit in the empty bakery, the lights dim, the scent of sugar still in the air. I'd listen to the soft hum of the refrigerators, the faint tick of the clock, and the steady sound of my son breathing upstairs, safe, home, whole. And I'd whisper to myself, "This is what survival sounds like." That Sunday, Daniel and I attended church for the first time in months. When we walked in, people turned, their faces filled with admiration and apology. I felt dozens of hands pat my back, dozens of voices saying, "You're so strong, Juliet. You're so brave." But when I sat down in the pew, all I could think about was how fragile strength really was, how easily it could crack, how easily it could be rebuilt. The choir began to sing Amazing Grace. Daniel reached for my hand. I squeezed his, eyes closed, letting the lyrics wash over me like a prayer. When the song ended, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not pride. Not anger. Just peace. Outside, the air smelled of rain and freshly baked bread from the bakery across the street. The sky was soft and gray, the kind that promised new beginnings. Daniel smiled faintly. "You know, Mom," he said, "Dad always said you were the strongest person he knew." I looked at him, my heart aching in that quiet, familiar way. "He was right about one thing, then," I said, smiling gently. We walked home together in silence, the church bells echoing behind us, each step carrying us further away from the ruins of the past and closer to something that felt like grace. 6 months passed, and with them, the quiet rhythm of my new life settled in like sunlight through clean windows. The scandal had finally drifted into the background, replaced by whispers of admiration, curiosity, and eventually, respect. People still came to the bakery, not to gossip anymore, but to celebrate what they called my comeback. They brought flowers, took pictures by the display counter, and posted about Mrs. Roberts, the woman who turned heartbreak into success. If they only knew that every loaf of bread, every flaky pastry, every warm smile I gave them was my way of reclaiming myself, one recipe at a time. Daniel was now officially managing the second branch downtown. I'd named it Juliet's Rise, a quiet nod to everything I'd survived. The opening day drew a crowd so big that I almost cried when the mayor himself stopped by and said, "You've done this city proud, Mrs. Roberts." He didn't know the half of it. That night, after everyone had gone and the new ovens had cooled, I stood in the middle of the shop, running my hand over the smooth countertop. The scent of vanilla and sugar lingered in the air, and I realized something that had once felt impossible. I wasn't thinking about Julian or Allison anymore. Not even with bitterness. They had become ghosts in my story. And I was finally living among the living again. One afternoon, while I was arranging cupcakes in the display, a familiar voice broke my concentration. "Still making magic, Mrs. Roberts?" I turned. It was Thomas, the investigator. He looked the same, calm, steady eyes, that quiet air of someone who's seen too much but judges nothing. "Thomas." I smiled genuinely for the first time in ages. "You came to visit." He nodded, holding up a small paper bag. "To return this," he said, handing me a flash drive. "You left it with me after everything." I took it carefully, my fingers brushing the cool metal. That little device had once held my pain, my proof, my downfall, and my salvation. "Thank you," I said softly. "For helping me see the truth." He smiled faintly. You didn't need my help, Mrs. Roberts. You just needed confirmation of what you already knew. I chuckled lightly. Maybe so. But sometimes the truth needs a witness. He nodded once, gave a small salute with his coffee cup, and walked out into the golden afternoon sun. I watched him leave, then slipped the flash drive into my pocket. For a brief moment, I thought about throwing it away. But then I smiled and tucked it into the cash drawer instead. A reminder, not of betrayal, but of strength. Weeks passed in peace. Daniel began smiling again, really smiling, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. He started seeing an old friend from college, a kind woman who helped him laugh again. Every Friday evening, we'd close early and sit outside the bakery, sipping tea as the city lights blinked on. The world kept moving, and for once, I wasn't afraid to move with it. One evening, as we locked up, Daniel turned to me. You know, Mom, he said, I think Dad must see what we've done and regret everything. I sighed softly. Maybe. But regret isn't the same as change. He nodded thoughtfully, then smiled. Still, you won. I looked around, at the glowing bakery sign, the warm lights through the window, the smell of fresh bread drifting out into the night. No, I said, smiling faintly. We both did. Later that night, alone in my room, I opened an old recipe book my mother had left me. Inside the front cover, written in her looping handwriting, were the words, "When life burns down your kitchen, rebuild the bakery." I laughed quietly through my tears. I had done exactly that. The clock ticked softly in the background. Outside, the wind carried the faint hum of the city, alive, forgiving, unbothered by the past. And for the first time in 40 years, I wasn't waiting for someone to come home. Because I already was. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the past finally came knocking. The bakery was calm, sunlight streaming through the front window, the smell of warm butter and sugar filling the air. Daniel was at the new branch, and I was alone behind the counter, humming softly as I arranged trays of croissants. Then the doorbell chimed. When I looked up, I froze. Julian stood in the doorway. His once proud shoulders were slumped, his face thinner, older. His hair, once neatly trimmed, had gone gray around the edges. He wore a plain shirt and held his cap nervously in both hands. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the refrigerators filled the silence between us. Juliet, he said at last, his voice quiet and rough. You look well. I didn't answer right away. I studied him, this man who had once been the center of my world, now standing like a ghost in the place he tried to steal from me. Finally, I said, you shouldn't be here. He nodded. I know. But I had to see you. He took a hesitant step forward. I've been sober for a few months now. Working down by the docks. It's not much, but it's honest. I folded my arms. That's more honesty than you gave me in 40 years. He flinched, but didn't argue. You're right. I've made mistakes I can't undo. I came to say I'm sorry. The words hung between us like fragile glass. I leaned against the counter, my expression calm. Sorry doesn't erase what you did, Julian. It doesn't bring back the years. It doesn't take away the humiliation you caused, not just to me, but to our son. I know, he said, his eyes wet. Daniel won't even return my calls. He shouldn't, I replied coldly. You don't get to break a family and expect forgiveness to rebuild it for you. He nodded again, silent for a moment, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. He set it on the counter carefully, like it might shatter. It was a picture of our bakery, this bakery, from decades ago. The two of us standing outside, younger, smiling, covered in flour. I was holding a tray of bread, and he had his arm around me. I keep this with me, he said softly. To remind myself of what I ruined. For the first time in years, my throat tightened, not from anger, but from a strange, aching pity. You didn't ruin it, Julian, I said, my voice steady. You just removed yourself from it. He looked up, confused. I gestured around the bakery, the clean counters, the warm ovens, the sign above the door that read Juliet's Rise. This, I said, is what happens when the storm passes. The ground grows things again. He swallowed hard. You always were stronger than me. No, I replied. I just stopped letting your weakness define me. We stood there in silence for a long time. Then he straightened, wiped his eyes, and said quietly, I'm leaving town for good. Starting fresh somewhere no one knows me. I didn't come here for forgiveness. I just wanted to see that you were all right. I nodded slowly. Then you can leave knowing that I am. He gave a small, sad smile. Goodbye, Juliet. As he turned to leave, I called out softly, Julian. He paused at the door. Thank you, I said. For walking away. He lowered his head, nodded once, and stepped outside. The bell above the door jingled faintly as it closed behind him. I stood there for a long time, staring at the photograph he'd left on the counter. In it, I saw the woman I used to be, young, hopeful, blind to the cracks forming beneath her feet. Then I flipped the picture over and wrote on the back in careful handwriting. This was not the end. This was the beginning. I slipped it into the cash register, between the bills and receipts, and turned the open sign back around. The ovens hummed softly again, warm and steady. Customers would be arriving soon. Life, as always, was waiting to be served. It's strange how peace doesn't come all at once. It comes quietly, like dawn, soft, steady, inevitable. You don't even realize it's there until you stop bracing for the next storm. A year had passed since the day the firefighters came. The city had changed seasons twice, and with each one, the whispers about that scandal grew fainter, fading into memory. But inside the walls of Juliet's Rise, the air was still warm with the smell of cinnamon, sugar, and second chances. Business was better than ever. The bakery had become something more than a shop, it was a symbol. People came not just for bread, but for courage. Women would stop me at the counter and say, "You taught us that love doesn't have to mean silence." I'd smile, hand them their pastries, and think, if only you knew how hard that lesson was to learn. Daniel was thriving. The downtown branch now employed 12 people, and he was building plans for a third. Sometimes he'd drop by the main bakery just to sweep, fix a hinge, or refill the coffee jars. He didn't say it, but I knew why he came, because the bakery felt like home again. Because it still smelled like family. One evening, as we closed up shop, Daniel lingered by the counter, holding a stack of receipts. "Mom," he said quietly, "I got a message from Dad." I looked up, heart steady. "Oh?" "He's working at a shipyard in Charleston. Said he's sober, living simple. Asked if I'd ever want to talk." I wiped my hands on my apron, thinking. "And do you?" Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet." "That's all right," I said softly. "Healing doesn't follow anyone else's schedule." He smiled faintly, relief in his eyes. That weekend, the bakery hosted a small charity event for widows and single mothers, something I'd wanted to do for years. As I stood at the front, thanking everyone for coming, I realized my voice didn't shake anymore. I spoke of rebuilding, of resilience, of the beauty in broken things made whole again. The room was quiet, the kind of silence that listens. Afterward, an older woman came up to me, tears shining in her eyes. "You remind me of who I used to be," she said. "Before I forgot that women can rise from anything." Her words lingered long after she left. That night, I stayed late cleaning the bakery alone. The lights were dim, the ovens cooling, the world outside calm. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, alive, glowing, forgiving. Then I took out the small photograph Julian had left behind, the one of us from years ago. I didn't cry this time. I simply smiled. Turning it over, I saw the words I had written months before, "This was not the end. This was the beginning." And for the first time, I understood what they really meant. Because life hadn't ended when Julian betrayed me. It hadn't ended when my home went up in smoke or when the whole world whispered my name in scandal. It had started again, raw, real, unfiltered. Before leaving, I placed the photo in a frame and set it on a small shelf near the register. Not as a reminder of pain, but of transformation. When Daniel walked in the next morning, he noticed it immediately. "You kept it?" he asked, surprised. I nodded. "Every story needs its first page, son. Even the painful ones." He smiled, then slipped his arm around my shoulders. "You're something else, Mom." I laughed softly. "No, Daniel. I'm just what's left when the fire's done burning." As the morning sun poured through the window, lighting up the fresh loaves on display, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not revenge, not pride, but fulfillment. The ovens hummed. The bell over the door jingled. And as I greeted the first customer of the day, I whispered a quiet prayer under my breath. "May every woman who walks through my doors remember that ashes can still smell like sugar, if you know how to start again." The story that began with betrayal had ended with peace. And peace, I realized, was the sweetest thing I'd ever baked. Dove outro. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in this woman's place? I'd really love to hear your opinion. Big hugs, and see you next time.